Thank you, folks. We're very honored to have here the president of NIRH. You saw the commercial before the film, Andrea Miller. Thank you, Andrea, for being here. And please welcome one of the producers of the film, one of the actresses of the film, and the person who really brought this project to life and conceived of it, Kate Cortelio.
Hi, everyone. That's quite a film, right? Let's give her a round of applause before we get started. So, I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the president of the National Institute for Reproductive Health. You saw a little blurb about us at the start of this film. There's been a lot of very depressing news. I'm sure one of the reasons you all turned out tonight lately, including even today, with the Title X gag law going into effect and decimating family planning services around the country. But I also want to let you know there's a little bit of good news before we turn it over to talk about the film. One of the things that we do is really try to move proactive policy in the states. And this year we've already had 7 states pass bills that support and expand abortion rights and abortion access. More bills passed in a single year ever since Roe versus Wade. So it is not all bad news. And that's what happens when we get involved at the state and local level and do something. So I just want to give you that little glimmer of hope before we get started here. I thought what we would do is talk a little bit back and forth. I have a few questions I wanted to ask Kate. I'm a huge fan of this film. I've known about it since it was like a twinkling in her eye. And just think it's such a privilege and a pleasure to be able to communicate with her and share her incredible insights with you. I think one of my favorite things about this is the origin story of this film. So Kate, clearly everyone probably is wondering, what inspired you to make this film? How did you make it happen? And did you have any idea 3 years ago that it would be so extraordinarily timely?
Yeah, so I learned about the Jane Collective 3 years ago. I was watching a documentary called She's Beautiful and She's Angry, which is just a history of feminism and women's liberation. And they just touch in this huge history of feminism for 2 minutes on the Jane Collective. And I couldn't get my mind off it. I felt like the whole movie should be about them. And I went to an all-women's college. I went to Barnard, and I'm the third generation, I'm the third generation of women in my family to volunteer with Planned Parenthood. I'm a lifelong feminist. And, oh my gosh, hi! we escort together at Planned Parenthood. Yeah, so I just felt if I didn't know about these women, how many other people who should know about them didn't? So it really just started as me wanting to tell this piece of women's history, because I feel like women's history is so frequently erased. And I had no idea that it would be so relevant. This was before the election. This was May of 2016. And I just started writing a treatment and brought it to Rachel Carey, who I know from the Shelter Theater Company, and asked her to write the script, and she said yes. And we went from there. And by the time we were actually filming in 2017 in the summer, it had taken on a whole new urgency.
So one of the things about this film that's so intriguing, I think, is it is not a documentary, right? It's a biopic, so it's obviously predicated on actual events, but there are some pretty incredible characters here, and I would think it would be amazing for people to hear, who are these people real? To what extent are their stories real? To what extent is this a fictionalized kind of composite? Talk a little bit about that.
It's a good question, because we really wanted to be careful with both triangulating research to make sure it was all in the public domain, so you didn't bump into any lawsuits, and with not bumping into life rights. So all the characters are fictionalized. Some of them are an amalgam of stories, but all of the people on screen are made up. But Judith Arcana, who was an actual member of the Jane Collective, and she has a cameo in the movie. I don't know if you remember the scene where the policeman comes in with that young girl, Laura. She's the older one with the gray hair and the glasses who says, "You're going to be fine." That's Judith. And she was our consulting producer. So she read our early drafts of the script and gave notes, and Rachel rewrote the entire thing after talking to her, which was crazy because it was already great, but then it was great again. So yeah, it's really a composite of a lot of people and stories, and just trying to fit in a lot of history into one movie.
And one of my favorite things, if I understand correctly, is Dr. Charlie is pretty clearly a real guy. And nobody actually knows who he is. But Dr. Charlie was actually real, not really a composite, like seriously real.
Yeah, and we accidentally, when I first had the idea for this movie, it just sort of came to me like a thunderbolt, and I wrote down my concept, which expanded a lot with Rachel's work. But I wrote down some character names for my character and for the doctor, and I accidentally got them right, Judith said, and we had to change them.
So I guess one last question I'll ask, and then I'm sure people have a lot of questions, which is, what was really what would you consider to be the most important thing that you wanted to convey with this film? I think I've asked you that.
No, you haven't.
Sorry, I sprung that on.
No, it's a good question. For me, the biggest thing is just the disparate reasons for why a woman might seek an abortion and might need one, because it's so varied. And it affects so many different people. You know, there are people who are teenagers, and there are people who are already mothers, and there are people who are victims of rape, and there are people who it was just an accident. There's so many different reasons. So I was just interested in humanizing those stories, because I feel like a lot of the conversation has sort of gotten away from the individuals that are affected by the policies that are made.
Great. So let's turn it over. I think we have Mike that we can run up. Does anyone have a question? Oh, let me ask one question of all of you, though. How many of you knew about the Jane Collective before seeing this movie?
Oh my gosh, so many.
That's a great number, actually. Excellent. And how many of you are going to tell people to see this movie? All right, everyone's hand should go up for that. All right, great. Now that you're warmed up with raising your hand, let's see if we have some questions. Got one all the way back there. You're gonna get your exercise too.
Wonderful, wonderful film. I was wondering how you were able to get funding to make it.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a long story, but first I tried a crowdfund, and I was like, everyone's gonna give $1, and it's gonna go viral, and it's gonna be amazing. But we didn't go viral. But it got a lot of outreach and a lot of awareness thanks to that. I was just reaching out to literally every person that I'd ever met in my entire life. I keep business cards, I keep, Excel sheets, and I just reached out to every single person. And I'm a member of the New York Women in Film and Television, so I went through their membership database, which is 2,000 women, and I just Googled every single name to see who might have money and who might be interested, and I just sent emails, just cold emails. And I took a lot of meetings, and one of them was with Caroline Hirsch, who is the founder of Caroline's on Broadway, the comedy club. So it was sort of, a reach that I'd reach out to her, because she's, the queen of comedy, but she's a feminist and an amazing woman, and I just had a hunch, and she wanted a meeting, and we sat down and just talked for an hour about the time period and abortion access and women's rights and feminism, and at the end of the meeting, she said, I want to produce. So my co-producer, Josh, says that it's a lot easier than it's supposed to be. But it seemed very difficult.
Other questions? Right over here. Sorry, I keep making you run. Maybe you can pass the mic down or something.
Yeah, I can just project.
You can project.
Okay, it was great. I really loved it. So this may be an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you have any knowledge of any other similar endeavors in any other cities or other states? It was just Chicago?
There was a group in New York, actually, that was through the clergy, right?
Yeah, there was a clergy consultation community, clergy consultation service, I think it was, that actually helped women find places that they could go. I don't think that there was any, to my knowledge, there wasn't any other formalized collective that was actually women providing the abortions themselves, but there were other systems in place to get women to places and to people who, usually it was medical providers of some sort, who were willing to risk doing it. That's what I know of. I think what made the Jane Collective so unique was that they learned themselves and discovered that actually an early abortion is an exceedingly easy procedure. And that was before medication abortion or pills.
I thought it was fantastic, and I will tell every person I know about it. But I have a question about all of the women who went to that Dr. Charlie, and it was pretty clear that he was not sterile. These were not sterile instruments, and there was not one person who had an infection or seemingly in the storyline suffered any consequences. And it was pretty apparent to me that those were not circumstances under which normally someone would not walk away with a pretty raging problem. So I'm curious about that.
So, in the whole history of the Jane Collective, they had one casualty ever, and it was a woman who had already attempted it herself with a knitting needle and refused to go to the hospital and died from an infection later, and the Janes tried to help her and couldn't. In terms of not having gloves in the movie, is that what you're asking about? Because so that's basically just a problem of budget and time and props. Sorry.
So thanks for making the film. I'm wondering what the women are doing now.
So Judith, who is our consulting producer, is a writer, and she lives in Portland, Oregon, and is very active there, and still writes a lot about her experience with the Janes, and writes poetry and chapbooks. There's also Laura Kaplan, who wrote a great biography about the Janes called A Story of Jane, and Heather Booth, who was the founder in real life of the Jane Collective, who is not really like my character at all. She was always an activist and a huge advocate for women's rights and for voter registration. She is still really politically active. There's a documentary coming out soon about her and how to organize. And she came for our premiere in New York. We premiered in May 17th on the East Side, and she came and spoke. So those are the people I know what they're up to.
I know you had your hand up for a while, but I see it was one in the front.
I was in Chicago during that period, and I wondered if you were informed at all by the series on in the Sun-Times, the abortion clinic series that won, I'm not sure if it was a Pulitzer, but...
Like a TV series?
Sorry? The Sun-Times newspaper had a series, and it was called this, Abortion Clinics, and two reporters went underground to report on what took place in abortion clinics at that time, and it won all sorts of awards. You might want to take a look at it.
I will. I don't honestly remember if I already read it or not, because when I was doing research for the film, I just holed up in the New York Public Library, the big one with the lions,
Yeah.
and I just tried to get all the magazine clippings and newspaper clippings and books from the time period that I could find. So I may well have read
It
it.
may have been toward the end, I don't remember the exact date, but somewhere in the early to mid 70s, I believe, is when that series was written.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Here's some more in the back. She was next.
What was your process in terms of getting the actors?
We hired a casting director, Eve Vitaglia. She was super. And a lot of the bigger names like Cody and Sarah Steele and Sarah Ramos, Ben, Allison, they didn't audition. They just had Skype meetings with our director, Rachel. So she could just sort of get a feel for them and their energy and what part they would make the most sense in. Yeah.
Would you think it's accurate to say, I certainly felt this when been around the cast and you and the other producers, there's a real love for this film.
Oh,
The
yeah.
people the stars, the talent, everyone just loves this film. Do you think that's an accurate, it was really a labor of love.
Yeah, this is a low budget film, and these are, the woman who plays my mom, Allison, was nominated for an Emmy while we were shooting. These are people who are used to earning a lot more than they were, but they were all working for the same rate because they just believed in the project and they wanted to tell the story, which was awesome. And then a lot of the other secondary and tertiary characters were friends and favors and people from our theater company, The Shelter. Lot of favors called in on this movie.
And if you recognized any of the scenery, Park Slope and Windsor Terrace.
So what is the, two questions. What are the distribution plans beyond the screenings? And on the trial, did that trial really happen? And did it really, like the prosecution didn't have a case kind of thing, like the way it was shown in the film?
Yeah, so when I'll answer that part and then I'll go back. The court case, they really didn't have sufficient evidence, and even the cards that they had all the information on, the women really did eat them when they were arrested, which was a detail that I added in when we were shooting it. I was like, wait guys, this is important. And none of the women who had been pregnant were pregnant anymore by the time of the trial, because they did call around and find someone to help them, and not a single person was willing to testify against them. So all the charges were dropped, and it was after Roe versus Wade had been passed. And then, what was your other question?
About the distribution.
Oh yeah, so our distributors are Level Film. We opened in May in New York. We had a week-long run at the Village East, and we ran for a week in LA, Laemmle Music Hall. And we've had screenings all over the country, just shorter screenings, like a day or a week. And those are continuing. And then they're negotiating VOD sales right now, so we're hoping to start streaming at the end of this year. And I'm not sure where yet, but not Netflix, because they turned us down.
I think we can take 2 more questions. I think there was one all the way in the back. And I want to see if there was anyone on.
It's a comment, which I'd like to dedicate to my aunt who bought me my first Our Bodies, Our Cells book. Yeah. She passed a year ago, and I wish she could have been here tonight. So my comment is that your film universalizes the need for abortion for women, like, as you said, for all different reasons. And I think that's a message that really needs to get out there. I think the other thing I would ask you to emphasize is how linked this is to birth control and education. And the fallacy that women aren't going to have sex is ridiculous. And it still persists in a lot of these Catholic schools and similar communities. So if you can get those 2 messages out, the abortion rights, and link it to the birth control and sex education, you're going to save a lot of people a lot of grief.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was great. One last question. Anybody? Over here.
Has Ruth Bader Ginsburg seen this?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I hope so. Gloria Steinem has.
You should get a copy to her. Seriously. What did Gloria say?
Gloria said it's a movie that should be seen by every American, and we liked it so much we put her quote on our poster. Thank you, everyone. You can follow the movie on all the social media, Instagram. I handle the Instagram, so give me feedback if you don't like anything. Ask for Jane, and askforjane.com. There's a mailing list you can subscribe to keep updated on information.